Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Brihac, and I'm a consultant with McKinsey Company based out of the Geneva office in Switzerland. Prior to McKinsey, I worked for a construction company in North America. And at McKinsey, I work with stakeholders across the construction ecosystem, from owners and investors to engineering firms and construction companies. It is no surprise that the issue of sustainability has become a top concern for the construction sector. Since pre-industrial levels, global temperatures have increased by more than 1 degree Celsius. The construction industry, like every other sector, is slowly taking note of the pivot towards sustainable buildings and processes, aiming to support the net carbon neutrality to be achieved by 2050 by most government agendas. Today, I would like to focus on the transition risk for the industry and highlight some findings from a recent McKinsey research in this area. First, decarbonization of the construction industry is very important. The construction industry is a gigantic ecosystem. Across its entire life cycle, it affects 25% of total emissions and 40% of global CO2 emissions. Of these, approximately 30% are generated by processing materials, with the balance of 70% generated by building operations. Given the size of the impact of the industry, we expect to see a lot of pressure across the construction value chain to do something about it. The construction industry is also very complex, with multiple players involved and far less ability to impact emissions by adjusting just a few parameters. And the output, which are the finished buildings, the projects, are locked in for over 50 years, which is the typical life expectancy of a building. As a matter of fact, in 2050, when the building sector is supposed to be close to net zero CO2 emissions, 80% of the future stock is already around today. Therefore, one of the biggest drivers for decarbonization, the sector, will be not just the construction, but also the renovation of the existing stock. Second, in terms of sustainability, the construction industry is like a giant which is just waking up. In a recent survey done by McKinsey with CXOs across the industry, 79% of them classify sustainability as the top priority for their organization. While some other sectors are already quite advanced in their sustainability journey, and the construction industry has been lagging so far, we see evidence that this is truly taking off. So some examples that we see are, for example, steel players have invested in excess of $16 billion into researching and converting their plants to be more carbon neutral, for example, like leveraging hydrogen fuel. Cement players are starting to create spin-off incubators, which work on net zero cement production processes. Most large engineering and design firms now offer full life cycle solutions, like offering digital twins and other end-to-end solutions which can be applied from planning all the way to building operations. Most larger construction companies are announcing targets. For example, a lot of the EPCs are announcing net zero construction processes by 2030. And even from the digital space, a large construction software platform now has created a carbon calculator that's free to access for everyone, where as an owner, you can actually estimate the carbon footprint of your building. So therefore, what are some of the solutions to these issues? At McKinsey recently, we've done two analyses. First, we looked at building operations, which generates 70% of the emissions in the sector. And we scanned more than 230 million buildings across Europe and did a detailed modeling of the most cost-effective decarbonization pathways that you can take for these buildings. Second, we looked at construction and processing of materials, which generates pretty much the balance of 30% of emissions. We took a sample 5-story building and modeled emissions generated by each step of the construction process. We found from this analysis the following. Number one, for building operations, 70% of the energy that goes into the building is used for space and water heating. And while energy consumption is not the same as emissions, it can be a good indicator of where to focus. We also quantified the impact of abatement solutions for space and water heating. And we found that the average cost for abatement of building operations is approximately €5 per ton of CO2, which is much, much lower than most other industries like agriculture, which is €25 per ton of CO2, or transport, which is €120 per ton of CO2. That means that the low cost required for abatement of such a big chunk of global emissions, their construction and building operations, could actually favor the sector into rapidly taking off over the upcoming years. Looking at the cost benefit of these solutions, we found that no-brainer moves are solar and thermal localized generation, gas boilers, and low to mid insulation. We also saw across the full spectrum of solutions that while insulation is important, it actually plays a smaller part towards carbon neutrality, and that replacing heating sources accounts for about 80% of the total solutions. So that was for building operations. For constructions, about 60% of emissions are generated by concrete and steel processing, followed by 25% for other materials like gypsum, tiles, and glass, which is a long tail of too complex to address. And finally, about 10 to 15% only is generated by transport and on-site construction activities. The overall abatement is slightly higher than building operations, especially due to high investment in cement and steel production processes. And looking at the solution space, looking at the cost benefit of these solutions, we found that no-brainer moves are, as you can probably expect, optimizing the building footprint and design. And other solutions with high impact include alternative materials, reusing existing or on-site materials, and finally, new technologies for material processing and electrification of on-site heavy equipment. So what can we expect next? As we saw, construction industry generates 40% of CO2 emissions. But through building operations has one of the lowest costs to abate it. And this will probably create significant external pressure on the ecosystem, which can accelerate adoption of the sustainable solutions. We also saw that 80% of the stock in 2050 already exists today, which most likely will soon attract lots of focus on rehabilitation of existing structures. However, with so many different players along the different phases of a project lifecycle, no player can address any large opportunity alone. And therefore, they must break out of the current silos. And to that end, we also start to see activity across companies. For example, financing stakeholders, they start to implement sustainability requirements in their investors. And this is not just the checklist of the investment criteria, but it's also an important dimension which defines their portfolio strategy. We see infrastructure and real estate owners starting to ask questions, how do we secure green steel? And then we see material manufacturers like steel players starting to estimate the demand for hydrogen-based steel in order to identify investments in their production lines. So overall, this informs us that we are at a point where everybody feels this is important, wonders what everyone else is doing, and starts to make commitments and investments in sustainability, which further suggests that we are about to see a huge takeoff in sustainability in our industry. So this giant, which has been sleeping and slowly waking up, might be awake quite soon and up and running. Thank you.